clinical terminology has a lot of potential in further improving clinical research, biochemical research. And the reason for this is because there shouldn't really be a disconnect between what we're doing when we're performing research on things to be used in the clinic and what actually happens in the clinic. And so the most fidelity preserving, the clearest way of expressing what goes on in those clinical interactions with patients is to use the language and the documentation that comes straight from those interactions. I think a lot of times that language that's used over here in care gets translated and filtered and switched around a bunch of ways before it makes its way to a researcher who, for example, is developing drugs. But if we can shorten that distance, and of course a lot of what we do at IMO Health is on collapsing that distance to preserve clinical intent and knowledge. If we can shorten that, then there's a much better way of linking sort of the trajectory of new therapeutic development to the needs that are actually present in the healthcare system that those new therapies will hopefully meet. Without that specificity of language, those two things can decouple, but keeping the development linked to that clinical reality, I think, can keep them better in sync. IMO Health does quite a lot to help life sciences teams extract meaning from clinical data. I think that there are a bunch of ways that we do this. One of the most powerful ways is by saying, essentially, we can use tools like our normalized product to take raw data and transform those data and normalize those data into more consumable for research endpoints, without losing a lot of the fidelity that you typically lose in cleaning up those raw data and getting them to a final state. We can do that because of our terminology richness, our ability to keep track of all of this input terminology and put it where it needs to go in an output sense. But that gives us the ability to help structure data sets for use by research teams without losing a whole bunch of that clinical intent. I think one other way that we do this, help life sciences teams to extract meaning from clinical data, is actually by showing or providing a window into what's going on at the point of care in interactions between clinicians and patients. Because we have the privilege of interacting with physicians at that moment, right? It is our technology and terminology that are being used in billions of interactions throughout the year and throughout the globe. We can say, here's how the physician community at large is thinking about a particular disease. When they're going and typing in a specific condition, we can say a lot of physicians are using these terms to reflect their understanding of this condition, or they're not using these terms over here. Maybe that's an opportunity for life science organizations to say, hey, we need to do some more education to the physician community that it's actually important to distinguish these two subtypes of a disease from one another, because we can see that physicians aren't doing that in practice, right? So that ability to have a window into how physicians are thinking and documenting in their own language before we go through that process of transforming the data, I think that's quite a unique thing we can do to help life science organizations understand how their treatments are used and where the gaps remain. So this question, where can AI help make the biggest impact in life science research? I feel like whatever I say is probably going to be wrong in 6 months or a year or 2 years, because who can predict where AI is going to take us in the next few years or even the next few months? I would say there's a few areas that are most exciting to me. One is certainly on the molecular discovery side. That's obviously not core to what we do at IMO Health, but the use of AI to figure out how to design drugs, how to test drugs, how to predict how they'll perform in people. That's just a tremendously exciting area where I think AI is going to do a lot to accelerate new therapy development and make it less burdensome to ultimately to patients. The other thing that I think AI is really exciting about is this idea of more rapid insight generation. Knowing how different pieces of information relate to one another is really powerful and important, and also not very easy to figure out in things like real-world data sets, right? We can observe that a patient started over here, maybe they had some symptoms, they went to a doctor, maybe that doctor didn't really know what to do with them, forwarded them on to another doctor, maybe they got some tests, got some interesting, non-obvious results, went back, tried a medication, it didn't work. Like, all these kinds of things happen. We know they happen, we can describe them. But I think AI will help us to tunnel into and dig through these data sets more and more to say, here's the big picture of that trajectory. And actually, there's a bunch of people who followed this same trajectory. Here's how it connects to their biology. Here's how it connects to how they respond to treatments. That sort of insight into patient journeys ultimately can help us get closer to what drugs work for what people. And that's what the pharmaceutical industry wants to improve. And I think AI is going to do a lot to help us there. AI in healthcare, I think, will always need human expertise because humans interact with healthcare as humans. Maybe that sounds a little too cute, but I truly believe that unlike a lot of other fields, there's a sort of irreducible human element in healthcare. That doesn't mean that AI won't transform the field, and it doesn't mean that a lot of things that are done manually right now won't ultimately be done by AI. But what it means is, I think, at the interpretation level, at the application level, ultimately at the decision-making point, certainly, where it's patients and physicians who are trying to take all the information that they can have and make the best decision about treatment options, those elements of the process will always, as far as I can foresee, require humans. And that's why I like to think of AI in healthcare as an assistive tool, right? We're not interested in turning healthcare over to AI. We are interested in using AI to help us being physicians, patients, all those who support those critical actors in the system, to do what they need to do faster, better, with better information and with less friction. But at the end of the day, that sort of necessity of human connection and how we deal with each other's health, I think that's why we're going to need humans in the loop as far as I can foresee in this area.